Let's do this. So, hey, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Sacramento Public Library Sacramento Room program. And this happens to be the second installment in our Take Me to the Water Black Histories of the Pacific series. We are very, very grateful that you're here with us tonight. Our first talk last week was with the wonderful Dr. Caroline Collins, who is really the creative force behind the exhibit, Take Me to the Water, which is actually going to be with us in the main lobby through March 16th. And really quick, I'm going to push out, in case you want to share the event with other folks. We have it up on YouTube, and I just pushed out that link. So keep that in mind. So, and also, like Dr. Collins' talk, tonight's talk is going to be recorded. Thank you, Chris, for allowing us to do that. So we should have the talk up probably in about 2 or 3 days. Shouldn't take too long. I'll render the video, put in some bumpers, and then we should be ready to go. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Chris Dixon of Marcquarie University of Sydney, Australia. Professor Dixon's research focus is American history, including African American, U.S. military, and U.S. cultural history. Tonight we talk about his very impactful 2018 book, African Americans and the Pacific War, 1941 to 1945, Race, Nationality, and the Fight for Freedom, and published through Cambridge University Press. The library will have copies very soon, so please hang in there, and we'll definitely have them on the shelf. One review of the book that I wanted to share with you all comes from University of Cincinnati professor James Westheider. And the professor writes, Chris Dixon has written an insightful and superb study of the African American experience in the Pacific during World War II. Comprehensive and meticulously researched African Americans in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1945, is destined to become one of the standard works in the study of the Black experience in World War II. So that's extremely high praise, and we're just really lucky to have Dr. Dixon with us here tonight. So the standard structure of our talk is I'm going to ask questions of Dr. Dixon, but when I'm done, definitely want to open things up to the group, and we can have just a nice chat. And it's also important to mention that tonight's talk kind of lays the groundwork for understanding our next talk, which is going to take place. It's a brick and mortar talk at Central Library at 1 o'clock on February 24th. Historian Chris Langa, who's with us here tonight, will be talking about the impacts of the Pacific War on Sacramento attorney and civil rights icon Nathaniel Colley. So another reason why we're so fortunate to have Dr. Dixon with us here tonight. By the way, it's Dr. Dixon's Friday in Australia, but we are not going to hold that against him. We're almost there, Sacramento, so hang in there. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Dixon, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your research with our community. I was wondering if you could simply just start us off by providing an overview of your book.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, James, for the pardon me, excuse me, kind words of introduction. And thanks everyone for turning up on Zoom. I'm sure we're all in the States as we are in Australia, almost finished and over Zoom, but it's the best we can do under these circumstances. And look, it is a really generous invitation to have an opportunity to speak about my book, which I've just realised it's 6 years ago that it was published, and that time has flown by. So I approached this book after having written my previous couple of books, which were co-authored, were about the Pacific War. One of those was a kind of cultural history of the Pacific War, where we looked at the the experience of the war through the lens of Hollywood. And by that I mean that we realised that a lot of the American and Australian servicemen who served in the Pacific, when they went there in 1942 and 43, were expecting to find Dorothy Lamour and the images that had been on the movie screens in the 1930s. And almost always, of course, they were disappointed. So one of the chapters in that book was about African Americans in the Pacific War. So I had a kind of entree into the topic there. But more broadly, if I can go back just a little bit further and speak briefly about my longer term interest in African American history. In 2000, I published a book about African America and Haiti in the 19th century, focusing particularly upon African American immigration to Haiti in the early part of the Civil War. And it's not very well known that about 2,000 African Americans migrated to Haiti in 1860, 61 and 62. So that's a separate story. But one of the things that really interested me in that story was this tension between African American identity as Black people, as Americans of African descent, and their identity as Americans. And so I've kind of kept that question has sustained me through many years of researching and writing about history. So when I came to think about the Pacific War, I was approaching it through that lens of the culture that I mentioned earlier, but also through this question of how did Black men feel about going to fight on behalf of a country that denied them their rights. And that's, you know, kind of long-standing and well-recognised fundamental tension in American history, in American culture. So when it came time to write the book, that was really the thematic focus. So rather than writing a chronological account, I approached it thematically. There is a kind of chronological sense to it, but principally I was not so much interested in the individual battles, as important as some of them are, or the kind of minutiae of military history in general. I was interested in asking bigger questions about how African Americans felt about fighting on behalf of a democracy that didn't give them their democratic rights in a war that was supposedly all about freedom and democracy amongst people across the Pacific who were often victims of colonization themselves. So there was all this melange of interesting questions that came to my mind. And so research for this book really commenced a long time ago, if I'm thinking about the ideas in my head. And I'll be happy to talk about some of the sources I used, but that's how I kind of approached it. And that's really the framework in which the book is positioned.
Okay. Thank you so much for that overview. And the questions that I'm asking do have sort of a chronological flow to them. But the first one relates to the interwar period. And we were talking earlier about, you know, I've spent a lot of time reading about the Pacific War, watching shows here and there. And so much of what I came across in your book was virgin snow for me, and things that I really hadn't thought about. And including this first question relating to the interwar period. So during the interwar period, the African American press in the United States and many Black leaders took notice of Japan's ability to check white imperialism and white supremacy in the Pacific. But even with an all-out propaganda effort by the Japanese, including Tokyo Rose all the way through the war, efforts to influence the Black community failed. And I was wondering if you could address that question and just tell us why.
Sure. Thanks, James. And look, that is one of the foundational questions of the book, really, I think, about when we think about identity, African American identity. And you're right to talk about Japan's efforts in the interwar period to position itself as the anti-colonial authority especially in the Asia Pacific. But I think before we talk about that, let's just go back a little bit further to why the Japanese thought this might fall upon receptive ears in the African American community. And there we can go back to W.B. Du Bois and think about the deeper question that he raised about this tension, this dual identity that African Americans have felt. So there has been this long-standing thread in African American culture and history to connect the African American struggle in the United States to larger questions of imperialism, colonialism, and white liberation. So that was the context in which Japan, really from the beginning of the 20th century, but certainly accelerating in the interwar years, did attempt to win the hearts and minds of African Americans. They, I think, I say they, I mean the Japanese, I think were fairly hopeful that they would be able to, if not persuade every African American, but certainly persuade a significant number of the Black leadership that African Americans owed no allegiance to the US, that if they thought critically and sensibly, they would join in this anti-colonial struggle and really attempt to subvert white power, which Japanese meant as United States power. So that was the Japanese intention. Why it didn't work? Well, a simple answer, a simplistic answer, a glib answer, is that African Americans viewed themselves first and foremost as Americans. You know, they were a long way removed in many respects from, of course, direct experience with Africa, which is not to say they didn't sympathise with or understand or take an interest in Africa, but they always viewed that through the prism of their American experience and their American identity. And they were not seduced by Japan's attempts to undermine that allegiance. The qualifying factor here, a qualifying factor, I think, is that we must be careful not to homogenize the African American community. And of course, I've just been doing it. But the African American community was, in a lot of respects, a lot of different communities. And one of the, we can talk about African Americans in the South having different experiences from those in the North and those sorts of things. But another way to think about it is in terms of class and consciousness. And so for the educated minority, or part of that educated minority, I think there was certainly a deeper interest in participating in this anti-colonial struggle. I think for many African Americans, their struggle in the interwar era, remember this is the Depression era, their struggle was to put food on the table and to get work. And so for them, this was, in a sense, some of the questions that the Japanese were asking, I won't say they're abstractions, but they weren't the immediate concerns that the Japanese anticipated they might be. So there was this tension in African American culture that the Japanese identified and sought to take advantage of, but which I think was, I think in retrospect, it's easy to say this, of course, I don't think it was ever going to sort of win the hearts and minds of the majority of African Americans.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dixon. So the next question I have, many of our guests will recognize the Double V campaign, fighting fascism abroad and fighting for freedom at home. But in the Pacific, many African Americans viewed their fight as part of a Triple V campaign. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. This question, the idea of the Triple V campaign came to me when I was thinking about how African Americans in Australia during the war, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on perhaps, were aghast at the White Australia policy. And they viewed part of their mission as being to challenge the White Australia policy. And that was a kind of third pillar to the Double V campaign. So I coined this phrase, the Triple V campaign. Now, of course, it doesn't have the same resonance as the two other pillars of the Double V campaign, but I think it is fair to say that many of the African Americans who fought in the Pacific War, who participated in the Pacific War, certainly as the war progressed, were increasingly inclined to see their mission as part of that larger global struggle, that anti-colonial, anti-imperialist quest for freedom. And they, in many cases, saw themselves as leaders in that. So that's really what I meant by the Triple V campaign. It was to complement the fight against fascism abroad and the fight against racism in the United States.
Okay. Thank you. So you'd mentioned one of your previous books, and Hollywood and the War. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into the fraught relationship between African Americans and Hollywood during World War II.
Sure, thanks. Look, I think there the first thing to say is that, as has been the case for so much of African American history, African Americans are largely invisible, or certainly were largely invisible in much of what Hollywood produced during the war. Invisible to the white community, of course, not invisible to the black community. We always need to be mindful of that qualification. And in fact, some of the films that were made explicitly on behalf of the Defense Department during the war did attempt to redress that imbalance. There were various films made that were explicitly designed to foreground the contribution that African Americans were making. The Negro Sailor, I think, was one. But when we look at those movies now, what strikes us, and this is an unfair thing to say in some respects, is how clumsy they were. And what they show, I think, is just how far Hollywood had to go in terms of being inclusive and mindful of African Americans as part of this military democratic project. So there were some movies did portray African Americans, or attempted to portray them in a reasonably positive light during the war. Bataan is one movie that we mentioned, where an attempt was made to be more generous and fair-minded towards the part African Americans were playing. But all too often, African Americans were just invisible in this story. And there, I think, let's think about Gone with the Wind, which was made just a little bit earlier than this, and the kind of very crude depictions of African Americans that characterised much of that film. So Hollywood was reflective of the broader American culture. It didn't, in my reading of it, it didn't really challenge those preconceptions. It tended to reinforce and in fact reconstitute some of the preconceptions. But I think another point to make, if I may, James, just quickly, is that many of those omissions, that kind of invisibility of African Americans, has persisted long after the end of the war. That African Americans have often been neglected from the large popular narratives of both the Pacific War and indeed the European War. And this is an enduring issue. I'm sure African Americans look at these movies and say, why aren't we there? We were there. We were fighting. We were playing our part. But all too often they're rendered invisible through this omission.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. So let's go to Australia. And by late 1942, thousands of American troops were pouring into Australia. And by the way, earlier we were talking about the Spielberg, Tom Hanks franchise and all the things they've done. And they made an entire 10 episode series about the Pacific. They spend lots of time in Australia, but there is not a single African American in any of those episodes. So we are going to go to Australia now. And of those thousands of Americans that were going into Australia, about 100,000 were African American. Australia also had a white-only policy that would be in place until 1973. So generally speaking, what were the experiences of African Americans in Australia?
Okay, I've got a kind of long answer to this and a short answer. The short answer is much more positive than African Americans expected. And if I read a lot of newspapers and some correspondence from African Americans from late 1941, early 1942, when they were being sent to Australia, and they knew about the White Australia policy. The Baltimore Afro-American and the Pittsburgh Courier, all these newspapers were well aware of it. So they were really warning African American troops about what they might encounter in Australia. So they were very politically aware of that. the mystery is that when they landed here, many African Americans found Australians to be much less racist than they anticipated. Now, I'm saying this not to be boastful, but because it really is the case. And the longest story about this is a really interesting, I think interesting story about historical knowledge and how it's created. So many years ago, when my co-author for the first book, the earlier book, were researching the Pacific War, we heard in the sources these hints that some African Americans had written letters back home in 1942 from Australia, where they'd said, hey, these Aussies are not so bad. They're even welcoming us into their homes, and sometimes on occasions more intimate places. And yet we couldn't find these letters. We knew they had to be somewhere in the National Archives. So my co-author at the time, Professor Brawley, went off to College Park and asked about these letters and was told firmly, no, they just aren't here. We don't know anything about them. And I went back a couple of years later, and I should qualify this by saying at that point, I had a ponytail and looked perhaps a bit ragged, but they took one look at me and said, we don't know anything about these letters. And then Sean and I said, well, let's give it one more go. So we it's a long way from Sydney to College Park, but we took another trip to the US and went to the National Archives there. And we met one of the senior archivists, who's sadly no longer with us, a Mr. Taylor. And we explained about these letters and we thought they were there. And this is so long ago, it was pre-9/11. So he actually took us down into the bowels of the National Archives. It's like something out of a nuclear bunker somewhere. Went up to a shelf and pulled off a file of letters from African Americans written home in 1942, which was censored. They never made it back to their family members, these letters. And the reason for that was because the censors didn't want white Southerners and black Southerners hearing about how good race relations were in Australia. And of course, if the White Australia policy, with all its rigid racism, can be surmounted, then African Americans might say, well, why can't segregation in the South be challenged? So these letters were a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy in the South. So we eventually got hold of these letters and published an article, and they, in fact, informed the other book I mentioned, as well as there's echoes of them in the book under discussion today. So it's a really interesting episode in terms of how historians sometimes need to persist, and that the archives still can yield great mysteries and great rewards many years afterwards. And, you know, the National Archives, if any of you have had the chance to work there, is a vast organisation, much under-resourced like all libraries, with much more than they know what to do with. But this was a really critical find for us. And it really, I think, challenged the orthodoxy about the African-American experience in Australia. Now, why did Australians welcome African-Americans? Well, the first and obvious point is that, above all, African-Americans were Americans. Australians feared they were going to be invaded by the Japanese. So African-Americans were part of this American military presence that was defending Australia. But I think there's also another side to this that's equally important. And that is that African-Americans represented a kind of comfortable exoticism, if you like. Jazz music was popular in Australia. There was an interest in African-American culture. So when these soldiers turned up in 1942 and 43, it was almost like Hollywood had come alive for some Australians. So there was a real interest, and I will in fact qualify this right away by saying that was not universal. There were, of course, many racist Australians, but the experience was certainly not as bad or as intimidating as many African Americans had feared.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Dixon.
Let's make one more final point there, James, if I might. You mentioned that about 100,000 African Americans transited through Australia in the war. The Australian population at that time was only 7 million. So it was a very visible and significant presence in a pretty monocultural country.
Yeah, definitely a good point. So we're going to stay in Australia, and one of the stories you bring up in the book that I think is important for us to maybe explore a little bit is the Townsville Mutiny So I was wondering if you could tell us about the Townsville Mutiny, and are there any parallels with an incident that I think a lot of us in California are going to be familiar with, and that's the Port Chicago disaster of 1944. Are there any parallels? And then why was no one punished for the Townsville incident?
Okay. And that's a great series of questions. Now, the Townsville Mutiny is something that is largely hidden from history. So Townsville is in northern Queensland, a long way from major urban centres. And one of the things that the American Military Command wanted to do was to, and which they did, was station a lot of the African Americans outside the big Australian cities, because that way they were removed largely from white Australians. So there was an engineering unit, the 96th Engineers, stationed up there in Townsville, and they, like all African American units, were largely officered by white Americans, and a number of those white Americans, of course, were Southerners, who were contemptuous of many of the African Americans in their command, and quite frankly, just bloody racist. They treated these soldiers dreadfully. So the Townsville Mutiny, as I said, is largely hidden from history, but as best we can piece it together, a group of African Americans decided that they would punish, some people say set out to kill one of their officers. They were thwarted in that attempt. Another American unit heard about this, and then a white officer made his way into Townsville, and MPs and I suspect Australians came along as well, and the incident was quelled. And as I said, it's almost like an urban myth that has been hidden from history. But a historian up there in Townsville by the name of Ray Holyoake uncovered some of the stories about this, and I hope he eventually publishes the work he's writing on. So it was depending on who you believe, it was either a pitched battle with raging machine gun fire, or it was something much smaller. But in a sense, the scale matters less than the fact that it happened. And by that I mean African Americans are asserting their rights. They're not sitting down saying, we will take this. They're standing up to the abuses of authority that are being imposed upon them on a daily basis by often the white military command. African Americans had much more trouble from white Americans in Australia than they did from white Australians. Now, you asked why no one was punished for this. The principal, well, there's two reasons. Perhaps three reasons. One is that the unit, the 96th Engineers, was pretty soon afterwards sent up to New Guinea to take their part in the war. And as far as I can tell, and the documents are pretty clear on this, they did their job pretty well. So these soldiers who were mutinying went back to being soldiers and performed their duties admirably, as best we can tell. The other reason why no one was punished is that no one would testify against the African Americans who'd led this mutiny. And the way I read that is that this is actually a sign amongst the African Americans in that company and those units of African American solidarity. They didn't all agree with it, but they weren't going to dob their mates in, as we'd say in Australia. So it's a sign, I think a pretty powerful sign of African American solidarity amidst this war. So it's a really interesting episode. I fear we'll never know too much more than we know now about it. The sources for this are really disparate, and paradoxically, some of them emerged in Lyndon Johnson's papers in the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, because he briefly visited Australia, and an American journalist wrote to LBJ about this. So when I was on the Fulbright in Austin back in 2017, I was able to find this document. But it's like a historian's detective story. As we all know, you just find bits of evidence and do what you can with them. But I wish there were more evidence available for this story.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dixon. So across the Pacific, African Americans served with distinction. Seabees, there's the 24th Regiment and the 93rd Infantry Division. And it wasn't until mid-1944 that these two units, the 24th and the 93rd, were actually allowed to enter combat. And again, both units served with distinction. What factors kept them out of the fight for so long?
Look, there's a number of reasons. One of which, or the principal reason really, James, I think, is that it suited the white military command to not put these blokes into battle. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that they were not confident that the African-American soldiers would perform well. They feared they might run from battle. And there were one or two instances of that, but no more so than there was in any other unit. There's nothing particularly racist in saying that. So there was, I think, a concerted effort on the part of certainly the mid-level and senior white military leadership to keep these African Americans out of battle. The corollary to this is that these highly trained infantrymen ended up doing stevedoring and other manual labour tasks for much of the war, which were not unimportant. Of course, they were absolutely crucial. But to infantrymen who'd been trained to fight, who were chomping at the bit to do their bit for the nation, to be kept out of battle for so long was incredibly frustrating. And this became a political issue. It was taken up in Washington, and eventually the military command, the army command, buckled and sent these troops into battle. And as you said, overall, both units fought well. They did not disappoint their commanders. Just as an aside, I'll just very briefly, if I may, digress to the Korean War. And at the moment, I'm writing about African Americans in the Korean War. And as you all know, the military was desegregated between World War II and the Korean War. But the last major black infantry unit that was not desegregated in 1950 was still the 24th Infantry Regiment, which was sent off to Korea in July 1950, soon after the North Korean invasion, and participated in the first UN victory of the Korean War at the Battle of Yuchon, which was not a major battle, but it was a battle. And that has largely, again, been hidden from history, or has been until they've finished the book and articles we're working on at the moment. So the 24th Infantry had a long and storied history. It was eventually desegregated in 1951.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question I'm going to ask, and then everybody can sort of jump in here with whatever they want to pose to Dr. Dixon. But you visit this various points throughout the book, but to what extent did the African American experience in the Pacific War impact the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, and then beyond in the US?
Look, there's a couple of things I'd like to say there, James. The first is that, as in every other American war, African Americans did their bit on behalf of the nation. They served with distinction. They shed blood for a country that had denied them their democratic rights. And when they came home, once again, they encountered racism. They encountered the institutionalized racism of not being able to vote, and the brutality, especially in the South, but not exclusively in the South, of violence to continue to deny them those rights. African Americans were still being lynched. Now, this is a moment in American history that is tragic in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a terrible story of the ongoing, sustained disenfranchisement and segregation and brutality against African Americans. So they had done their part on behalf of the nation, but they were being denied their rights. But of course, one of the things that happens in military life is that people become more aware of their rights. They become more conscious. And partly this is just because they're mixing with other like-minded people. And of course, African Americans are discussing the issues of the day in the same way that white Americans were, or Russians or Germans or anyone. So to assume they wouldn't be doing that would in fact, I think, be pretty racist. So the military experience, I contend, and this is kind of a postscript to the book, is very much a consciousness-raising experience. It tells African Americans, it shows them both the possibility of black power, if we can use that phrase, as well as the constraints and injustices that are still part of their daily lives. So what I would suggest is it informs their post-war activism. It gives them a language of liberation. It gives them a confidence in the power of mass mobilization. The treatment they receive when they get home gives them a very good reason to remain angry and to demand their rights. So it's in some respects, I won't say intangible, but it's an amalgam of a whole range of different things that go into informing that post-war civil rights movement. And the final point I'd make there too is to return to I think your first or second question. African Americans who served in the Pacific, of course, don't just see these things through the lens of American racism. If they've been part of the fight to liberate the Pacific from the Japanese, they've seen Japanese imperialism, but they'll also be acutely aware that much of that region has been colonized by the Europeans during the 19th century. So they see the connections between their own oppression and the injustices being suffered by Indigenous people across the Pacific. So there's a whole range of factors, I think, that go into informing that African-American consciousness, to feeding their determination, their resolve to achieve their own rights.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Dixon. I am done with my questions, everybody, but here's Dr. Dixon's book. It's fantastic. It's a very smooth, quick read, meticulously researched, and well worth your time. Now, what I want to do, everybody, is open things up a bit. Do we have questions from our audience out there? And you can go ahead and take your mute off, or you can go ahead and type something into the chat as well if you'd like. Maddie, hey.
Hi, I have a question. Dr. Dixon, I recently read a book about the vast number of young underage teenage boys who lied about their age in order to enlist and fight for Great Britain during World War I. And I wondered if there was a similar phenomenon among young teenage African Americans. Were they as enthusiastic to lie about their age in order to fight for a country that really didn't treat them well?
Look, I can't talk about specific numbers, of course, but yes, there were certainly some. And particularly in that immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when passions were running high, tens of thousands of African Americans volunteered, and I'm sure some of them were underage. I couldn't tell you how many. But perhaps equally importantly is that initially, a lot of them were turned away from the recruiting centres. They weren't welcome, despite the fact that they were offering their services. But look, yeah, certainly there were some African Americans who lied about their age, as I'm sure there were white Americans. But sorry, I can't be any more specific about numbers than that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Chris Lango. Yeah.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's good. Good to see you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Dixon, for your book and your talk so far. It's fascinating. I mean, I've been there with you in the archival journey and being frustrated and exhilarated. And so the story you told about trying to find those letters at the National Archives and then initially not meeting with success and then saying, let's give it another try. And then you go back to Maryland and then you actually get down there into the bowels and find that file or that folder. What did you think?
Only another historian can appreciate just how exciting that moment is.
Well, that's my question. When you found that or discovered it and even read the first letter, what went through your mind and your heart?
Well, two things. One is that absolute sense of excitement, but coincidentally, one of the first letters was from someone called Dixon. So, of course, people have forever asked since then, is it a relative? And no, there's no relationship there. But look, it was terribly exciting. I mean, as we all know, archival research is always rewarding, but it's also often very frustrating. And it's a testimony to how long ago this is, because certainly post 9/11, as far as I know, they don't let the public down into the archives in the way that Sean and I were allowed in those days. I mean, the scale of it was was numbing in the sense that you realize just how much material they've got. And I guess in their defense, the other point I'd make there, Chris, is that when I go to Maryland and College Park and get frustrated they can't find this or can't find something, it's often the case they simply don't have the resources to locate and catalogue a lot of what they've got. I mean, it's one of the crimes of successive governments in the Western world, probably the whole world, that archives are under-resourced. Certainly in Australia, we've just had a big political battle and the federal government has finally said yes to devoting some resources to supporting the archives. But that in that case, we kind of knew that someone knew they were there, but they were holding out on us.
Wow. One other question, the subject I'm profiling, Nathaniel Colley, next week was a member of the 101st Chemical Company in the Solomon Islands in the Philippines. And I was just wondering, during your research and all these years, the chemical warfare, you know, his job and his unit's job was to impregnate suits with a substance called CC2 that would help protect soldiers from mustard gas poison when it hit the skin, for which he received a presidential commendation inside to his unit. So I just was curious, what if you know of anything about the chemical?
To be honest, Chris, I've just learned about it for the first time. I didn't know that. That's a fascinating story. That's intriguing.
This is a fascinating story, and one
what sort of sources can I ask do you have for that?
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to talk about my archival sources from the Center for Sacramento History. Actually, the Nathaniel Colley papers are there. Right. And in that, Mr. Colley developed brain cancer late in his life, and the substance he was working, one of the substances he was working with in the South Pacific was known to cause this type of cancer. And so there's a letter in the papers where he's writing, inquiring about veterans benefits, and he goes through all of this history in this letter. So that's one of the sources.
Sounds like it's great grist for the historian's mill.
Yeah. So and he also talks about one of the things he writes about is the closer everybody got to danger in the South Pacific, blacks and whites, the closer the danger was, the less the racism was. Yes. But then after the danger lessened, then you saw a lot of, officers disciplining soldiers for virtually nothing. I mean, do you have any perspective on that?
That is absolutely in line with everything I've ever read as well, that in the heat of battle, racism mattered much less, but as soon as the bullets stopped flying, those old racist hierarchies re-emerged. Just incidentally, James, you mentioned James Westheider's very generous comments about my book. So Jim's first book was about African Americans in the Vietnam War, and he talks explicitly and at some length about exactly the same phenomenon. In the heat of battle, there was not a lot of racism, but away from the front lines, the racism really re-emerged very, very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks, James.
Of course. Thanks, Chris, for your question, and Dr. Dixon for your answer. Kamal, you've got a question. Let's see if they're going to unmute. Kamal, did you have a question? Is it in the chat? Okay. Maybe not. Okay, Kamal, feel free to raise your hand or ask your question anywhere along the way. Does anyone else have a question for Dr. Dixon while we have him here? Okay. So, oh, you can't unmute? Oh, no. Let's see if I can do that. I should be able to. Let's see. So let's see, Chris, you could unmute. Wow, I thought I had all the power here to mute and unmute, but I don't think I can at this point. Let me see if I can mute everybody and then unmute. I'm so sorry. Can you write your question maybe in the chat? And then we can maybe go from there. I'm so sorry. We'll see if we can do that. So thank you, Krista, for your question. Is the book in the Sacramento Library? It is not, but it's imminent that it's going to be on the shelves. An order has been made through our collection services department, so it should be happening pretty darn soon. So hang in there. Hang in there. And you know what? You can come borrow my copy in the Sacramento room. I've got it. It's yours, but you have to give it back. So, okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, I'm looking through my notes here to see if I can go ahead and find more to ask Dr. Dixon. The one thing that I found really, really interesting, and this came up quite a bit throughout your book, Dr. Dixon, and it's the term, and I hope I'm getting it right, is white male masculinity, just the fragility of that in the face of having contact with African Americans in the Pacific, and it affects so many different things that go on vis-a-vis the African American experience in the Pacific. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit. Oh, Dr. Dixon, you are muted.
Okay, can you
There
hear me
we go.
now?
Gotcha.
Okay, sorry. Look, I think it's both a symbol or a sign as well as a foundation of racism is white masculine insecurity, to be quite honest. They are anxious about, well, one of the ways they exert their authority is through the masculinity. And so part of maintaining that means trying to deny African American their masculinity. And one way to do that is, for instance, to keep them out of battle, to almost, I won't say feminize them, but to demasculinize them by saying they haven't got the guts or the capacity to fight like men. And so every time an African American did fight like a man, it was a slap in the face of white racism.
Right. And this is just a recurring theme throughout the book, whether it's
recurring theme to the book, but it's also a recurring theme to American culture.
Right.
That, denying Black men their masculinity is a way, it's a foundation of oppressing Black men and Black people.
Okay. Thank you for speaking to that, Dr. Dixon. So unless we have other questions, I think we might be wrapping up very soon. One more call for questions. Okay, so I think that's it. Dr. Dixon, thank you so much for your time. And again, a happy Friday to you. We're completely envious. We've got one more day, but have a great weekend. Thanks for your research. We're going to be looking out for your next book on African Americans in the Korean War. We may have you come back. We'll see. But
there's actually two books in progress. There's that one,
okay,
and another about Americans who were in Australia during the Vietnam War, because Sydney was a place, an R&R destination for Americans in the Vietnam War. So about 300,000 Americans visited Sydney for a week between 1967 and 71. So there's two books in the pipeline, although the pipeline might be a bit long.
Okay. Well, hey, it's great to hear that you're keeping the history alive. We love that, and keep creating content. It's great. And thank you for visiting us.
Thank you very much, James, for organising this, and thank you everyone for turning up. I really enjoyed it. It's nice to have some time to talk about history rather than being an executive dean and having meetings. This reminds me of why I'm an academic.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
My
We
pleasure.
appreciate it. Everybody, thanks so much. Again, this is being recorded, so I'm going to push it out in a couple of days onto our YouTube page, and tell your friends, tell everybody. And thank you so much for coming tonight, and enjoy the rest of your weeks. And hopefully we'll see you next week on February 24th. Chris, who just spoke, is going to be giving his talk on Nathaniel Colley, a real Sacramento hero. So thanks everybody, and good night.